Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. Today we have an examination of yesterday's Missouri primary election results. Joining me in studio are St. Louis Public Radio political reporters Jo Mannies, Rachel Lippmann, and Jason Rosenbaum. After a long night and early call today, they are no doubt running on fumes. We had some major headlines yesterday. Right to work fails. McCullough loses. Stenger hangs on. Joe, where do we start with all of this? Lots of good stories out of the election.
First thing, Prop A won big, but it had no coattails. So you had all these major figures who were in the Prop A camp. Some, like Stenger, who had really tied himself to it. Stenger barely held on. Bob McCullough lost. Jay Kummel, the state senator who is the number 2 labor guy in the state, he's the number 2 guy at the AFL-CIO, lost. You had so many people who had tied their fortunes to Prop A. Bob McCullough, not as much, but there had been an assumption that he would benefit by it. Nope, nada.
Nada. That's the big story of the day. Rachel, what's your take?
I kind of have to agree with Joe, and I think Jason's going to chime in on this as well. Is just Bell's victory over McCullough is a big deal. Like, this was not something that was close. This was 57-43 in a county where the population is still overwhelmingly white. So this is a race that had to have a broad cross-section from all races, and it obviously did. He was appealing to North County, to South County, to West County. I mean, he picked up endorsements of traditionally of townships in South County and West County, ones that you would think would traditionally go for McCullough or other white candidates.
Clearly, Jason, Ferguson played a big role in that.
I think it could have, but I think we cannot overemphasize how, I would say, significant Bell's victory is. Like it or not, there are some white voters who will not vote for black candidates, maybe because of racism, maybe because they're just used to voting for white candidates. And there was kind of an assumption that a black candidate running countywide in St. Louis County without the support of, labor unions, which are not exclusively white, but are somewhat majority white.
Especially the traditional laborer, plumbers, pipe fitters,
that they couldn't win.
Bell.
Like, Charlie Dooley won several times when he had the support of organized labor. When he lost the support of organized labor in 2014, he got destroyed by Steve Stenger. Bell proved that you can run countywide without the overt backing of organized labor. You can appeal to a multiracial electorate. And I think that this is going to be a victory that's going to be looked at as a paradigm shift in St. Louis County politics. And I also think it may be studied for years by political scientists as what changed politics in St. Louis County.
What struck me in this is kind of watching it play out on Facebook, because I had a lot of friends who live in St. Louis City who were getting involved in campaigning for Bell, is it seems that it just got people engaged with the election. I mean, McCullough hasn't had a serious electoral challenge since, I think, 1994 from either side of the aisle. The Republicans just don't run a candidate against him. They're content with him being in office. He had somewhat of a challenge in 2014, but still won with like 75-80% of the vote. I think Bell went out and talked to people. The national groups that wanted to get involved in this race because of criminal justice reform went out and talked to the voters, whereas I'm not saying McCullough doesn't campaign. I don't live in St. Louis County. I don't get the door knocks on these races. But how much of that was just I expect to win, whereas Bell is going out and saying, let's just talk to people. Let's get them engaged. So they may not know anything about him. They're willing to listen to what they were willing to listen to what Bell had to say. And you just got more voters engaged in the race.
Yeah, I knew a lot of young lawyers, some who I know pretty well, and others who are kind of, progressive young whites in St. Louis County who are going for Bell. At my house, because I live in Webster Groves, I got 3 mailers from Bell, got nothing from McCullough. Now, what I'd heard, I was at the Stenger event last night, and it was full of gossip for hours because they were waiting for the returns. I mean, I was hearing that McCullough really didn't recognize the threat until a few weeks ago, like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And by that time, it was too late to raise the money. And there were certain things he didn't want to do. I mean, because there was some outside people who were willing, I'm told, to put up money, dark money or whatever, and he wouldn't do that. But by the time he recognized it, it was too late because he's not used to having to run a campaign. And I thought it was intriguing. He and Steve Stenger had been joined at the hip in the 2014 election.
McCullough and Stenger.
Yes. And McCullough's early endorsement of Stenger had really been key to Stenger's bid to defeat Charlie Dooley. This time, the two, while they were still friends, they weren't campaigning together. They weren't even mentioning each other. And I thought that was interesting. I think there was an assumption that for whatever reason that it was better not to be tied to the other guy. And as it turned out in Stenger's case, I mean, as I said, he just barely won.
I think it's like 1,100, 1,000 votes.
It's
1,100 votes.
0.64%.
And I just got to point this out. Like Prop A, which was the initiative to decide whether right to work is repealed or stays in place, I think it failed in St. Louis County with over 70% of the votes.
Yes, 72% of the votes.
And Stenger had every labor union endorsement. So as Joe mentioned, by that logic, like Stenger should have been the beneficiary of that voting block, and he only won at this point by 1,000 votes. So something went terribly wrong in that campaign to get to that point because by just basic math, excuse me, my water bottle just fell. By just basic math, he should have won by 10 or 15 points.
Well, there may even be a recount, and that Mr. Mantovani, I believe, is weighing that possibility.
There could be, but in my experience of looking at recounts, if the margin is like 1,000 votes, it's difficult to make that up. But, stranger things have happened. So,
and it's legally within the you can ask for it, not have to go through court kind of thing. The state law says it's a 1% margin of victory, and it's a 64/100th. What was interesting, what somebody reminded me of, though, in the sort of whole no on Prop A thing, is that more people within the state voted against Proposition A than there are card-carrying union members in the state. So no on Proposition A doesn't necessarily mean that you are a union member. It could be that you're a union supporter and want and object to the notion of right to work and therefore want to vote for it. Now, as Jason pointed out, yes, you would think that with the endorsement of all of traditional labor and with how motivated the base was, Stenger and McCullough should have won, Stenger by a wider margin, McCullough maybe make the race closer. But a lot of the people who were supporting Bell for the criminal justice reform reason are probably also right to work. They are pro-union, just not necessarily union members.
Right, Joe?
Yeah, and a couple things. I think that we also should not ignore. I did a story a year ago about the power of African-American women in the Democratic Party. And I think yesterday's results showed that. I mean, Jay Cummel got defeated by Carla May, who's a state rep in the city, African-American. The 14th district, which is Maria Chappelle-Nadal's seat, is going to be represented by a woman.
That's not true.
Okay, well,
Brian Williams won that.
Okay, yeah, at the end. But the point is that Sharon Pace came close. The assumption of who would win didn't work out. So I think that it's intriguing to me that there is a lot of maneuvering going on behind the scenes within the Democratic Party, just as there are in the Republican Party. And some of it has to do with gender. Some of it has to do with generation. And so I think that some of the stuff that we saw yesterday, either in close races or final races, that sort of echoed that. I mean, that Wesley Bell's victory may have been as much about generation as about everything else.
Well, that's an interesting point because there were a few races yesterday in which younger candidates prevailed. I think of Sharon Carpenter, for instance, losing. She's been in that job for 40 years or whatever.
Yeah,
and a millennial took that seat away from
State
her.
Representative Michael Butler, a millennial, will be recording deeds in the city of St. Louis.
Yeah, and everybody, I mean, I want to emphasize, these victories weren't easily won. The victors in every case worked hard.
Yes.
I mean, as did many of the losers. But the point is, this was not just something that people sat back and watched happen.
No,
they made it happen.
From what I've heard, like in that recorder of deeds race, which I make fun of a lot because recording deeds is funny, Michael Butler worked extremely hard because I think that he knew that even though Carpenter probably wasn't raising huge amounts of money, she still had huge name recognition and a lot of institutional support. And the only way to end up defeating an incumbent like that, even one who has encountered controversy over the last few years, is he had to go everywhere in the city and pull it off. It was a really impressive victory by Representative
What's funny
Butler.
about the recorder of deeds?
I don't know, because I'd like to kind of like think it's the most important office in the world, even though, and it really is an important office.
It is.
Like you have to you get houses deeds recorded there, or you get marriage license or a death certificate, but I don't know. I have a weird sense of humor, and I've always just found the process of recording deeds to be humorous for some reason.
Did the Secretary of State make a big mistake yesterday when he said turnout would be 30%? I think turnout was considerably higher than that.
I think it was 33.5 is what he said.
And see, it was so much higher in St. Louis County. This is the case for St. Louis County, which is the largest jurisdiction in the state. If the voters show up, because they had, it was a huge turnout, little over 40%, and 70% of that, more than 70% of that was Democrats, they can have a huge impact statewide. That happened with the concealed carry thing back in 1999. That happened with the dog measure a few years ago. Now, it doesn't always stay because the General Assembly is dominated by rural interests, and they tend to resent St. Louis County when it really puts its foot down on something. So I'm real interested to see whether or not there will be an effort to pass a right-to-work law anyway next year, with the belief that, one of the reasons for the high percentage was that St. Louis County was so big in it.
Yeah.
Or if they kind of back off. I think it's going to be intriguing to watch.
I think that'll be intriguing to watch, but given that right to work failed by over 65% of the vote, I could see legislators kind of cooling off on that for the time being. I think they may go back to it eventually. I just don't think 2019 is going to be the year.
We were poking around a little bit on the numbers last night and sort of running it, comparing it to counties that went really, really hard for Trump in 2016 compared to the right to work. And there were some counties where Trump's winning 3-1 and right to work gets defeated, 2-1 or by 3,000 votes. So do you really want to risk, if you're a state rep, state senator in that district, being like, I'm going to overturn the will of the people in my district for the interests of big business? Do you want that campaign run against you?
Yeah, it would be one thing if right to work had failed like 51-49, because the dog breeding thing that Joe mentioned passed very narrowly.
Right.
But this wasn't even close.
I have to take a break, but one thing from you, Jason, and your usual perceptive self on NPR this morning, talking about the impact of the right to work vote here elsewhere.
I think that the right to work vote in Missouri will be used as a template for unions in other states to go on the offensive against anti-organized labor laws. I think the message basically is if right to work can be overturned in a state that Donald Trump won by almost 20 percentage points, I think it's not out of the question that it can be replicated in a place like Michigan or Wisconsin.
538 brought up the point last night, the Political Statistical Wonk newsletter, that this was the first major victory since, I think, a 2011 vote in Ohio for traditional union bases.
All right, well, let's take that break now. We are obviously talking about the fallout from yesterday's primary election here in Missouri. I have with me in studio Jo Mannies, Rachel Lippmann, and Jason Rosenbaum, our political reporting team. Back to continue this conversation in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University. With undergraduate and graduate programs, part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
And welcome back to our conversation about yesterday's Missouri primary election results. Okay, one of the big races that is getting zero attention today, in a sense, is one that the conclusion was a foregone one. That's the Senate primary, Joe.
Well, I think what's intriguing is that before everyone's trying to get the votes counted last night, McCaskill comes out with a debate challenge. This is U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill, the Democrat who won, against Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley, who is the Republican who won. He countered with his own debate challenge, and then she had a press call this morning at 7:45 a.m.
Thank you, Wayne Pratt, for recording that for us.
is having something out in St. Charles this afternoon. So they're really trying to shift away from the election and not talk about it. Now, there's a key thing here. McCaskill had been highlighting her opposition to Prop A and her aligning herself with labor unions. Hawley sidestepped the whole issue, never really said anything. I'm going to ask him about it today, but I'm assuming he's going to say the people have spoken, so forth and so on. My point being is that when I talked about no coattails at the beginning, I mean, for her, while she pushed it, and maybe that'll help her with some labor unions, when she looks at the results from yesterday, she's got to figure out that now there may not be any coattails from this in November, even if there was a strong support for it. And Hawley can probably breathe easy. The fact that he didn't take a big stand on it is probably not going to matter. I mean, they're going to be focusing on other things. So I think that is, and they're really, as I said, stepping up right away. There was an outside group that ran a really nasty personal attack against McCaskill. That's been, different groups have been running something like that for weeks, but they've really heightened it. Yesterday, having to do with her husband's divorce 20 years ago. In fact, his ex-wife has come out with a statement blasting it. But the point being is, it's already getting really nasty. All this stuff is going on, and it probably will have very little to do with what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
What are you looking for in that race, Jason?
The national environment. And one of the things that always amuses me about these U.S. Senate races is, you know, millions and millions and millions of dollars are spent on TV ads that nobody remembers, mainly, except for the Candor gun ad, which everybody remembers. And the ads may move the needle and may influence the percentage, but really what usually drives U.S. Senate races, for the most part, is what people are thinking about the president or the economy or things that are happening on a national stage. There are clearly outliers, like 2012 when, you know, Todd Akin disintegrated in front of our eyes. But at this point, I think that it's going to come down to, do Missourians like the direction that President Trump is leading the country? And if they do, I think that means Hawley has an edge. And if the support of Trump starts to diminish in Missouri, a state, again, that Trump won by around 20 points, then it benefits McCaskill similarly to 2006 when it was a bad year for Republicans, and she was able to beat a very good candidate in Jim Talent.
Was there an Eric Greitens influence in any of these goings-on yesterday?
No. I mean, there had been a lot of talk, and Jason's heard the same stuff, that apparently, assuming if Greitens had disintegrated as Missouri governor a couple months ago, he had been expected to lead an effort to defend Prop A. He wasn't there, and Governor Mike Parson, who I had interviewed about week and a half ago, had indicated he supported Prop A, but that he was going to let the people decide. So if you notice, you didn't see Parson traveling the state, you know, waving the banner for Prop A. He didn't. So I think that Eric Greitens' clout, whatever it was, is gone, and the Republicans prefer to ignore that he even existed.
Plus, he couldn't even vote, so he didn't even have that option.
Oh, apparently. I mean, I don't think any of us know where he is at this point. I certainly don't. So,
well, we certainly know where he isn't. That's for sure.
The governor's mansion. Yeah. Mike Parson's there.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about the congressional races. Particularly want to look quickly at the 1st District, Lacey Clay's district, and that challenge by Cori Bush, and she brought in outside help, and it didn't work. She got 36% of the vote. Do we read anything into any of this?
Well, some people are going to say, well, since Clay didn't break 60%, it was like a moral victory for Cori Bush, who I have to say is a candidate with a bright future, who engendered a lot of passionate support and did better than most Clay supporters or Clay opponents. But the fact of the matter is, Clay won by 20 percentage points, and he once again kind of proved this kind of lingering contention that his political muscle has atrophied, that he's a shadow of his father, that he doesn't work hard. I think that he proved everybody that narrative was total bunk. And not only did he win, but the aforementioned Brian Williams, who was an aide to Lacey Clay for many years, won a state Senate seat that is currently held by State Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadal, who, by the way, won a House seat yesterday. Yes. So that's a specific example of him not only winning his own race, but when he wants a candidate to win, there's no doubt in my mind that he helped Brian Williams win because he was working hard for him, similar to 2014 when Lacey Clay was stumping hard for Joshua Peters. And, I think that you underestimate Lacey Clay at your own risk, basically.
But we also have to take into account the tenure he has. This came up during our conversation with him. He's got a lot of clout there as a senior member of Congress.
I don't know how important that is anymore in this day and age with earmarks being kind of gone and written out of the budget. Like, it's harder to campaign on, I'm going to bring home the pork when you legally can't bring home the pork.
And that wasn't really his message. And if you look at what happened with Bob McCullough, having a lot of experience and being around for a long time doesn't necessarily help. I think Clay made some strategic behind-the-scenes decisions the last week or two. It was what I'd been hearing to kind of help coalesce.
And that was sort of playing out on Facebook in terms of you see people sniping about who he's behind, who he's not.
Right. Because, look, the Democratic Party in this region, just like the Republican Party, there's all these dramas that play out behind the scenes that nobody knows about.
Not all behind the scenes.
So, sometimes not behind the scenes, especially in the age of social media. But the bottom line is, Lacey Clay just didn't waltz into his 20-point lead. There was a lot of stuff that went on to kind of make sure that he did win, and he had to make some agreements. It's not like he could unilaterally say, I'm going to win.
But at the same time, people still have to vote. Moving one person from your camp to someone else's camp or vice versa doesn't automatically, get voters out to the polls. It's not, the old Chicago machine where you get the bottle of wine for pulling the lever for the candidate you're supposed to.
I never got that bottle of wine living in Chicago. But the key thing that I saw, because, I'm a really issue-oriented person, sometimes to a fault. And I talked with Cori Bush and Lacey Clay extensively about issues. And I'm not saying that they agreed on everything. Like the Paul McKee project, Cori Bush clearly was against, and Lacey Clay has been a big champion of. But on issues that they'd vote on in Congress, they were very, very similar. And if you're going to try to convince a congressional district that's been voting for either Lacey Clay or Bill Clay for literally 50 years to change side, you got to give them issue-oriented differences that I just don't think were there in this instance. So I think that Cori Bush ran a very, very good campaign. I think she has a lot to be proud of, and I don't think we've seen the last of her. But I don't think we've seen the last of Lacey Clay because unless I'm proven otherwise, he just keeps on winning.
The 2nd District, no surprise there. Of course, Ann Wagner won 89% of the vote or something like that, I think. But I've been intrigued, and we've talked about this before, about the amount of advertising that she has done. She's spending a ton of money when she should be a sure thing.
Well, hey, this is 2018. You see what happened in Ohio last night in a strong Republican district where it's still a cliffhanger. I think she, as I mentioned before, she didn't run any ads in 2016. Her staff says she didn't run any ads in 2014. That's in the primary or the general. And now she was running stuff before the primary. She sees what's going on, and she wanted to make sure that she's not one of the casualties come November. And she sees that on the Democratic side, there was at least 2 very strong candidates, Mark Osmak and Court Van Ostren. Van Ostren had a lot of national backing, and he ended up winning. But still, the vote was kind of split. I think people were throwing out stuff about how many Democrats turned out in the 2nd yesterday. And but some of that, you don't know if that translates into November. But I think she sees that she's going to have a threat. Van Ostren is already telegraphing that he's going to focus especially on health care and on her votes against the Affordable Care Act. And we'll see if that issue has staying power or not.
And I mentioned the 1st district race about how the 2 candidates are similar on issues. This is going to be a clear race where the candidates are very different on lots of issues.
Yes.
So the big question is whether that is enough to drive enough Democrats out to flip a district that is very difficult for them. But I think this is a really, if you like candidates with distinct views on things, this you're going to like this race between Court Van Ostren and Ann Wagner because they are different candidates, and I think that's what makes a race exciting, to be honest.
Well, it's the suburban Republicans. I think a lot of people forget that. the question is going to be is if the Republicans can woo back some of these suburban Republicans who, if you believe any of the polls, are not happy with Donald Trump and some of the stuff that's going on. I mean, the suburban Republicans are one of the reasons that Claire McCaskill had such a huge victory in 2012, suburban Republican women. So it's going to be intriguing to see if they side with Ann Wagner, see her as one of their own, or if they're like, no, she's too far to the right, we're going to go with this kid.
Well, he's been spending some money, too.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What I'm going to look for in both sort of Missouri 2nd and the Senate district or Senate race is whether the enthusiasm you saw in the primary ends up carrying over into the general election. McCaskill is not particularly a beloved candidate among younger, more kind of activist, progressive, whatever phrase you want to use for them, voters. It's whether they sit and look and go, we saw what happened when we didn't vote in the presidential election, and we need to preserve the candidate that is the better of the two options, or how much you get into it's not exactly what we want, so we're not going to support her. If they've kind of gotten all of we want to throw a cast a protest vote in the primary and focus in the general election on keeping the seat blue.
Yeah, and I'm interested to. I haven't talked to Claire McCaskill today, but I wonder what she thinks of Bob McCullough's loss, because those two have been close for years.
When they were both prosecutors.
And I'm not saying that they are exactly the same politically, but I think that they're part of the same political circle, and that political circle was soundly rejected in the state's biggest county. So I think she has to be looking at that and thinking, I need to pay attention to this as I'm trying to make sure I have the best turnout possible in St. Louis County.
Yes.
Our time is beginning to wind down to some degree. And any surprise with Proposition 1 in the city? That a lot of people were concerned about that possibly not passing.
Nope.
It passed handily.
No surprise there.
Nope.
We mentioned some of the legislative races. Anything else we should be talking about with regard to primary outcomes yesterday for legislative seats?
Well, I do want to mention that the charter amendments in the county,
yeah,
they did win. One of them barely, but so that will give Council Chairman Sam Page a little bit to crow about. He didn't knock off Steve Stenger, and they're both Democrats, but he and Page are at odds. but they did get these amendments, which will allow the council to hire its own lawyer, and also which will give council people more flexibility in their private practices. They'll be able to represent governmental entities. Now, that's assuming there aren't court challenges against either of these.
Which I'm assuming there will be against the one for them to be able to hire their own attorney, because the whole issue of the auditor and oversight and hiring of that position is working its way through the courts right now, and whether there's an authority on that for the county.
One thing that I was just tracking was whether voters in state legislative races voted for candidates with extensive governmental experience, or whether they preferred new faces. It really was kind of situational. I mentioned before that in a University City-based district, there was a four-way race where Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadal won pretty handily, because I think her name recognition there is very high, and I think that she's well-regarded in that community. But you saw elsewhere where, for example, Kevin Windham Jr. and Rachel Prouty in North St. Louis County seats ran against candidates who had been in municipal government for a while. Both of those two won pretty soundly. So I think it was kind of just a situational thing, but I did see a lot of new people beating a lot of established candidates in a lot of state legislative races.
Joe, you brought up something that I wanted to get to earlier but didn't, and that is the Stenger race and his relationship with the county council. Does the narrowness of his apparent victory mean that he's going to have to, well, he's certainly going to have to work harder to mend relations, but what's it going to mean for that relationship?
Well, it's probably going to continue to be strained. Now, he did put out some nice words last night. I was at his event for hours, and he didn't take the stage until after midnight. Unlike Mantovani, Stenger you didn't see him at all. And but he did put out some olive branches, lauded the council for siding with him on a number of issues over the last 4 years, saying he couldn't have been successful without them. He never said that during the campaign, but he said that last night. And then he said that he hoped that they would all work together to help St. Louis County. He says he's going to be meeting privately with some. We'll see. I think his one solid backer, Pat Dolan, another labor guy, in the 5th district lost his seat
to Lisa Clancy.
Lisa Clancy, a young newcomer.
There we go again.
So, yeah, right, exactly. So I think it's going to be interesting how it plays out. But I want to reemphasize, the St. Louis County Executive post has a humongous amount of power. So it's not like the council. I mean, the council is not the same as the St. Louis Board of Aldermen, where they can kind of run rings around the mayor if they want, because the mayor has limited power. In St. Louis County, it's not like that. So I think both sides are going to have to kind of reassess where they are and where they want to go.
But I think the council has tremendous leverage now, even with Stenger winning. That's my read on it.
We have to wrap it up. Let me get a final thought from each of you. I'll start with you, Jason. Final thought on all of this.
This primary made no sense. I'm still kind of confused and bewildered by everything, and I'll eventually figure it out.
Well, get a good afternoon's sleep. You deserve
Not
it.
happening.
Rachel?
No kind of general takeaway yet, other than just, like I mentioned, let's see how the enthusiasm continues. I think a lot of these races were based on an enthusiasm for the candidate, enthusiasm for the platform. Does that continue when you have the more sort of traditional Democratic candidates running?
Joe?
I think so much is going to, in the Senate race, is going to depend on the national climate. But I think also, I mean, we're seeing that what happened yesterday was kind of an earthquake in many cases, but I'm not sure how it's going to translate into November. And I think the candidates who are on the November ballot, especially Hawley and McCaskill, I'm sure they're aware of that, but if they're not, they better be. I mean, because it's going to be a rocky road the next 10 weeks. And not just for them, for the public, because they're going to be peppered with all these TV ads, millions of dollars worth.
And for you political reporters, by the way. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for being with us. Again, get some rest. I know most of you were up into the wee hours of the morning. Thank you, Jo Mannies, Jason Rosenbaum, Rachel Lippmann. Thank you for being with us. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.